Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Back to Watercolors. I'm so happy that you guys are here. I know it's been a minute since I've made a Back to Watercolors episode, and I'm really excited to show you this palette that's been hanging out with me untouched since 2021 is when I purchased it, and I never opened it or tried out any of the colors because I just didn't know where it fit into my art practice. Now that I'm doing this series and I am getting more comfortable with watercolors, I am glad to finally open these guys up and test them out and see where they might fit into my art practice. One thing I do want to let you know is that these paints come with a lot of plastic waste. So if that's something that you're looking to avoid, I would suggest maybe looking at some handmade watercolors that do not come in a lot of plastic waste, or even looking at the pigments of this watercolor palette and maybe trying to recreate something similar on your own. For this watercolor palette, the reason I purchased it was because I thought that the palette in its muted pastel quality would match well with the style that I saw a lot of my favorite artists go for. During the earlier stages of my art journey, when I was teaching myself art and looking at what other artists that I really admire were doing, I ended up spending a lot of money and time buying a bunch of different kind of media and testing out and seeing which one fit for me. And I don't necessarily think that it's a bad thing to do that, but it can be pretty pricey, especially when you buy a watercolor palette that you haven't picked up or thought about in years like I did. But I'm glad that I am using it now, where I am more comfortable with watercolors and more comfortable with my art style. I'm no longer chasing after another artist's dream or ideas or style. I am creating my own unique style, and now that I am more comfortable, I feel like I can really utilize this palette. I think this palette also comes with a learning curve that if I wasn't more familiar with gouache and watercolors, I wouldn't fully understand why they reacted and mixed the way that they did. I did go ahead and rearrange the pants in this palette in a way that made more sense to me visually. I think that maybe some people would, swap out some colors differently than I would, but visually I thought this was the most appealing scheme for me. And also because the pants dried down look different than when you wet them and use them on a palette, I kind of went from lightest to darkest color on my palette versus if they were more blue leaning or green leaning or pink leaning. So that's kind of how I organized the colors in the palette. You might have picked up from the swatches that these paints are not your typical watercolors. They do have I don't know how to say this other than like chalky, maybe. It's very opaque. It's more opaque than traditional watercolors, but not quite gouache. So I did use it in my face layer. I had fun throwing in colors where I thought they would fit, so I used a lot of the pinks and the blues, and I might have even thrown in some green to kind of frame the face. But overall, I thought it would be fun if I could find a way to use every single color on this palette in one painting, and I'm glad to let you know that I did end up achieving that goal, and it was a lot of fun to kind of plan out this painting, not really fully knowing or understanding how this watercolor set would mix and mingle, but figuring it out in this painting where it was totally no pressure and I was just having fun and just figuring out how this painting would turn out. And this painting was mostly inspired by Bridgerton, so I finished the Queen Charlotte series and I was bawling my eyes out literally for days. I cried for at least 3 days straight. And then after I got my emotions regulated, I wanted to make a piece that was very kind of reminiscent of that. So it was very futuristic. It's kind of vintage with the vintage pastels, and it's also kind of giving me the Queen Charlotte with the big bold hairstyles but more futuristic. And I just had a lot of fun just throwing in every single color, trying to make like a rainbow, and just having fun in general with this watercolor palette. One of the things that I definitely wanted to point out to you again is that when you put down the paints, it was kind of hard for them to move around. So I did sometimes wet my paper and then use one brush to like pick up a bunch of pigment, and then use my other brush that could hold more water and use that more to move the paint around where I needed it to go. Also, the paints are very light in color, so you would need to layer the paints up more if you want to see the color and have more saturation, but they do have a very muted pastel look to them, which was really nice and cute. And I think it worked really well as like highlights of color in the face if that's something you're interested in doing. Overall, because of my familiarity with gouache and watercolors, I felt like this paint kind of sat in the middle as opaque watercolors. They felt a little bit more opaque than my handmade watercolors in a way. I did find that they were a little bit more chalkier, I guess, maybe because of that white pigment that's in a lot of the formulas to kind of give it that pastel color. They're a lot chalkier than a lot of my other handmade watercolors that I have in separate palettes. I do enjoy using this palette, and I find myself picking it up a lot more in other artworks that I do, reaching for specific colors. You probably already know, my greens and my blues. I love them. I also really enjoyed using the black and the gray in this palette. I don't have blacks or grays in my other palettes, so it was really fun to kind of use them and be more free and bold with those colors, and also have them fit into this palette really nicely. Thank you so much for being here and watching this episode of Back to Watercolors, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye. Take care.